the head of the Heritage Seed Library, and her colleague Claire Pritchard, who will be taking the lead on today's session. And we also have Katie Hastings from the Gaia Foundation joining us. But before I hand over to Katrina, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping rules. This meeting is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Knowledge Hub. You're able to find all previous sessions upon the Knowledge Hub. We kindly ask you to use the chat box for any burning questions as we go through. However, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So over to you, Katrina.
Great, thank you very much. And welcome everyone, good afternoon. As has been said, I'm Katrina and I have my colleague Claire Pritchard here as well. We both are based at the Heritage Seed Library in the West Midlands, and Claire's a horticulturalist, and although I'll be leading on the presentation, both myself and Claire are going to be available to answer any questions. So as has been said, don't be shy about putting some questions in the chat boxes. At periods of time, I'm going to try and stop and catch up with any questions that you might have. But then I hope by the end of the session, we'll have a good Q&A opportunity for you to have some discussion about various crops and things that you want to know about. So here's what we're going to do this afternoon. Obviously, this is session 2, but really the first of a series of sessions that we're going to run around the actual seed production side of things. We're going to cover on this session basics from the very start. So I'm aware that some of you will have different levels of experience. You may already be growing for seed, or you're just setting out on planning what to do. So hopefully this particular session is going to give you some of the real basics that you need to know, and also help you decide what kind of crops you would like to start off with if you haven't done this before. I'm aware that we've got a whole series of crop types that we're going to cover over various sessions. Hopefully we'll cover some of them this afternoon, but bear in mind that we'll be looking at different crops throughout this series of webinars. So we're going to be looking at basic plant botany, in particular flower structure, how it's pollinated, what we understand by inbreeders and outbreeders, and really what that means in terms of isolation methods that we might need to use, and also population sizes. And at the end, we're going to do a quick sort of compare and contrast with some key crops that you might already be considering growing to kind of reinforce that knowledge. Hopefully, we're going to build on all of that knowledge throughout the session and in future webinars. So again, if something's not clear, don't be shy about asking us to pause and explain what's going on. So the first thing you need to bear in mind is an understanding of the life cycle of the crop or crops that you're going to grow. And in simple terms, plants can be divided into either annuals, biennials, or perennials. And the life cycle on the right there, the simplest one of all really for us as far as seed saving is concerned, is the pea. It's a very simple annual. In fact, it's one of the easiest crops to grow for seed, and perhaps one of the crops that you would consider starting with if you haven't done this before. And the life cycle is very straightforward. You're going to go at that perfect circle from seed to seed in a single growing year. So they are annuals. Biennials, different process for seed production in the sense that the plant is going to flower and set seed in the second year. So as far as your seed production planning is concerned, in fact, your first year growing may not get further than the first couple of steps in terms of your actual cultivation single year. And then perennials, that means these plants will have a lifespan of more than 2 years. Now, in terms of seed production, actually we really only divide our plants up into either annuals or biennials. So although strictly speaking, some crop types like peppers or even runner beans in other climates might be considered perennials, in terms of our seed production and our planning activities, especially around crop rotation, then we generally divide them up into annuals and biennials. So when we talk about specific crops, we'll try and explain what we mean by that as we go along. Second thing you need to understand about your crop is the flower structure. And we've got a very simple cross-section diagram here to try and explain what is a very simple flower structure. And really, the whole process of producing seed is simply about ensuring that the pollen transfers from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower to produce the seed. And all of our activities around seed production are there to facilitate that, to ensure we have a good growing season, to enable that to happen, and to make sure that then leads on to pollinated flowers and then onto seed production. There are, however, different flower structures that you need to consider. As part of your crops, we've got an aubergine flower here, and again, this is similar to the cross section that you've just seen. This is what we classify as a perfect flower. It means that it has the male and female components within the same flower, and in terms of seed production, this could often be the simplest flower structure in order to produce seed. They can be inbreeders, which means that they will happily self-pollinate, and we'll talk about what that means later on, certainly in terms of population size and isolation methods, or they could be outbreeders, which means they can readily cross-pollinate, or they can be a mixture of both. So some crop types will be partial inbreeders or partial outbreeders. However, another flower type you need to consider are the imperfect flower group. And these could be, in this case, we've got a squash here as an example, a cucurbit generally, where you will have plants where they have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. This means that they're monoecious, and obviously in terms of seed production point of view, the pollen has to transfer from the male flower, the pollen producing flower, onto the pollen receptive flower, which is where the plant will produce its fruit with the seed in it. And then the third type of flower, and again another imperfect flower, are the dioecious group. Now, from seed production, in our collection, we really only have one, and that's spinach, and that's illustrated here. And essentially, they have separate male and female plants. So obviously, in terms of seed production, you have the male producing flowers on the male plants, and the female receptive plants, which will eventually produce the seed. So again, in terms of planning your growing, obviously that determines how much space you need to use and which plants will actually end up producing the seed for you. The next thing to consider, and it's associated with flower structure, are the pollination vectors. Now, with these crops and with all the crops that we're dealing with throughout this course, we are dealing with open pollinated seed production. And essentially what that means is that with a bit of care, the transfer of pollen from one flower to the next, or within the same flower, is going to produce, with some of your attention, a seed that is true to type from one generation to the next. So we're not talking about F1 hybrids here, we're talking about this simple process. And for us, those pollination vectors, which will enable that to happen, are either going to be self-pollinators. In this case, we're talking about a pea. It's a perfect flower. It will happily self-pollinate at low risk of cross-pollination. We have flowers that are insect pollinated. These could be because they need to be tripped for seed in some way. So, for example, broad beans and runner beans. Or we could be talking transfer of pollen from one separate flower to another. Or we could be talking about wind pollinated. Now, you can tell the difference usually just by looking at them in terms of what are likely to be insect pollinated or wind pollinated. Our wind pollinated crops, and we're talking things like beetroot, sweet corn, spinach, generally don't have the same kind of showy flowers. They have a very fine pollen, and the idea is to transfer that pollen by wind. Therefore, the flowers often aren't particularly scented or not particularly attractive to insects. Now, for seed production, the key principle, and we'll keep returning to this over and over again because this is something that's really important for us at Heritage Seed Library, is in order to produce good quality seed in open pollinated varieties, we have to manage two things. Firstly, we have to prevent cross-pollination, and secondly, we have to ensure we're only saving seed from the very best examples. Now, this is really important for seed production, because for cross-pollination, you're not going to see evidence of cross-pollination until a future generation. And of course, for many of you who are considering setting up already established seed production on a commercial scale or for financial transaction, it's really important that you crack this and think about this from the very start, because it is extremely difficult to unpick a cross-pollination if you haven't been aware of what issues have happened during the growing year in which the seed has been produced. So I'm going to keep repeating that, really important, and we'll be looking at ways we can manage this. So that first principle of cross-pollination, preventing cross-pollination, well, this is where you need to start thinking about your planning for your growing year. So are you going to choose varieties that require little prevention of cross-pollination because they're unlikely to cross-pollinate, or are you going to look at strategies that you can set up in order to ensure that you can produce quality seed without risk of cross-pollination? So there are basic strategies that you can use to prevent crops from cross-pollinating. And we're going to look at a few examples here that you need to think about in terms of how you're going to prepare your growing spaces. So there are obviously physical barriers. And what I'm referring to is methods that will prevent the transfer of pollen from another variety into the variety that you're trying to save seed from. Assuming that you're not attempting a cross-pollinating breeding program, actually this is about ensuring that your variety stays true to type. So if you're growing a particular type of French bean or runner bean, you need to decide to what extent you need to implement these kinds of barriers to prevent cross-pollination. For us at the Heritage Seed Library, it's pretty straightforward, and I'll talk about our polytunnels in a moment. But there are various methods that you can be thinking about. Firstly, there are obviously simple meshing off cages, so you're going to prevent insects, for example, from transferring pollen during the flowering phase of your crops. Or it may be that you're located somewhere where you've got natural physical barriers to isolate you from another crop. You can use physical barriers to prevent transfer of pollen for individual flower trusses. But for us at the Heritage Seed Library, we tend to use our polytunnels in order to isolate. Now, depending on what stage of planning that you are at the moment, you might be deciding whether or not to invest in something like a polytunnel. You may already be using them for food produce, because if you're already established as a market gardener, for example. But this is one of the easiest ways that we use to produce our seed. Not only does it extend the growing year, and for seed production, ensuring a full year for seeds to grow and ripen to produce the next generation of seed, we also use them to isolate our crops. So we have mesh sides. We ensure that they are kept well isolated from other crops that we might be growing that are very similar, and we make sure that we're able to introduce pollinators where necessary. However, there are also some disadvantages, so you need to kind of bear that in mind. These polytunnels can get extremely warm, and we have had issues, certainly where we're located, evidence of increasingly hot periods of weather at critical times when we're trying to produce seed. So, for example, where you have high temperatures for prolonged periods of time, that can often damage the pollen. So if they're flowering at particular stages, that can sometimes be an issue. There are a number of ways you can think about that. You might want to stagger your sowing times to ensure that earlier sowing season to ensure that your flowers emerge not at the hottest time of year. And there are other ways that you can think about managing polytunnels. But at this stage, while you're setting out on your decisions around seed production, polytunnels are certainly what we use on site. Just go back a sec. There are other things that you can consider, and there are different methods for isolation that might be more suited to the way that you are currently set up. Obviously, the simplest way to isolate is to isolate by time. So if you are only growing a small number of crops for seed, it may well be that you can just grow an individual crop and not be worried about whether it will cross-pollinate with something else. So for example, something like a runner bee, if you're only growing one, then you don't need to worry about cross-pollination. You can isolate by distance. So let's refer back to that runner bee, for example. They do readily cross-pollinate. You do need to think about isolation distances, and our recommendation is at least half a mile from another runner bee variety if you are going to grow them uncovered. Another option, of course, is to stagger growing by time and isolate by time, not just by growing single crops in single years, but you could also stagger the sowing season. So a classic example of that, for example, is a broad bean, where you might sow in March and then sow a separate variety later on in the year, in the autumn, and then stagger the flowering for those. So lots of different things to think about. As you get to know your crops, and we're going to go through some specific examples, this will give you some idea how you will plan your growing for different crop types over your growing seasons, and what you need to do to make sure you keep those varieties true to type by ensuring that cross-pollination doesn't occur. Now I'm going to briefly attempt, I'm going to stop here just for a second to see if there are any questions so far. I will take that as a no questions in the chat box so far. That's fine. I will come back to those if there are any later on in the session. So I was going to briefly talk about some of the materials that you might want to invest in if you are going to use physical isolation barriers for your seed production. I'm going to attempt to change camera briefly, and then hopefully I can show you some of the items that we use ourselves. Okay, I don't know if you can see the screen up on there. That's great if you can. I just wanted to briefly talk about the options you have for netting use for your crops. And we have got two grades of mesh here that you might want to think about. There's a coarser grade of mesh, and I'm not sure how well this is going to be demonstrated on the camera here. And this mesh side is 1.3 millimeters by 1.3 millimeters.
I'm sorry, Katrina, we can't see your camera at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for letting me know. And in that case, I'm going to move on from that. And apologies for that. Just to advise you that we have got the detail of mesh and isolation barriers in the toolkit notes which are associated with this. So hopefully you'll get the information you need from there. But apologies for that. I will continue on.
Yeah, Katrina, we can actually see the camera. It's just that it's on.
It's not very clear.
No, we can. You just stop screen sharing, then we'll be able to see it, I think.
Okay, let's try that.
It is on your camera. Yeah. If you put it on speaker view, then when Katrina's talking, you should be able to, yeah.
Okay. How does that work? Is that working okay?
It's great. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so hopefully you can see the screen. Thank you. Hopefully you can see the screen. So all I wanted to very briefly cover was to quickly look at the mesh types that you might be considering investing in if you're going to go through the isolation route for crop production. And we've got a couple of different ranges. One is much finer than the other, and the details, as I say, will be in the toolkit notes. But we use a much finer mesh than is standard. So this is a 1.3 millimeter by 1.3 millimeter, and that works pretty well if you simply want to keep basic insects off your crops like butterflies, bees, flies, etc. But we do use a much finer mesh, which will help us keep pest and disease, keep things like hopefully help towards pollen reduction for wind pollination, but also help with things like brassica issues with whitefly, etc. Like I say, I'll refer you back to the toolkit so you've got some idea of the actual details of that. So the next key issue that you need to consider when deciding what crops you're going to grow is the importance of population size. So going back to that key principle of ensuring that you that you prevent cross-pollination and only save seed from the very best examples from good quality seed. The important part of that is ensuring that you maintain a healthy and genetically diverse population. And for different crop types, you need to consider the population size that you'll need to ensure that that happens. The issue otherwise is potentially concerns around inbreeding depression. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's just recap. If you remember, we talked about how pollen needs to transfer from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, either within the same flower or across flowers, depending on the way that it's been set, the type of flower type that it has. However, for certain types of crops, we need to consider whether or not they are inbreeders or outbreeders. And inbreeders will happily self-pollinate without the risk of inbreeding depression. And what that means in terms of your planning for your space and the size that you need, is that you need relatively few plants to ensure that you have got a healthy genetic population. Of course, the larger the population, the better. And obviously, in terms of seed production and seed yield, that's really important to ensure that your efforts are going to produce a good seed yield. But for these crops that I've illustrated here, this is less of an issue. So if you're starting out on deciding what crops you would like to try to grow for seed, these may well be the easiest crops to begin with. So we're talking pea, French bean, and tomato here, most tomatoes, and we'll talk about some exceptions to that. We recommend, and certainly we grow on site, a minimum of 10 plants for peas, 15 to 20 for French beans, but maybe only 6 to 10 for tomatoes to ensure a healthy genetic pool for your seed production. The next type are what I mentioned earlier as partial inbreeders or partial outbreeders. They may have perfect flowers, but they may also cross-pollinate. So I've got some examples here of broad beans, peppers, runner beans, some exceptions in the tomato group, which I'll talk about in a moment, and lettuces. So all of these can happily self-pollinate to a certain extent, but they will also readily cross-pollinate if they're not isolated in some cases. So most tomato varieties, I class them as an easy group to start off with, but most tomato varieties will happily self-pollinate, which means that you don't need to isolate them in the same way. You don't need to introduce pollinators. They're quite straightforward to grow for seed. There's some exceptions to this, and for us in the Heritage Seed Library, where we're growing a large number of heritage varieties, we have a higher proportion of flower types which are at risk of cross-pollination. So this particular tomato here, for example, has an exposed stigma. Most tomato varieties have enclosed stigma, and they will simply self-pollinate as a perfect flower. For crops like these, and if you're going to be venturing in specifically into heritage varieties, if that is where your interest lies, then you do need to bear in mind that some tomato varieties will also cross-pollinate. As partial inbreeders, we tend to have a slightly larger partial outbreeders, sorry, we tend to require a slightly larger population. For something like a broad bean, we tend to go for a very minimum of 24 plants. For runner beans, 20 to 30 plants, and certainly for things like lettuces, we're talking 10 plants or more. But you can reduce that population size. Again, it depends on your seed yield that you're planning to grow. Outbreeders, now they may have perfect flowers, and those flowers may be self-incompatible, which means that they can't self-pollinate. And an example of that is onions and brassicas. They may have separate flowers, imperfect, like squashes, for example. or they may have separate flowers on different male or female plants, separate male or female plants, like the spinach that we discussed earlier. All of these flowers need another flower in order to pollinate and set seed. But it also means that they can cross-pollinate very readily. And these are the hardest group to produce seed true to type. This also means that they need a large population size in order for them to be able to produce a healthy crop of seed. And continuous inbreeding as a result of a small population size will result in inbreeding depression. Now, for you as seed producers, that obviously has a significant impact on quality of seed longer term, further down the line, and it will decrease its yield, vigor, and overall production. So that's something that you need to understand when it comes to the population sizes that you need to plan for and plan ahead for. So for something like, to give you some idea of the range we're talking about, when we contrast them way back with very simpler crops like peas and French beans, for something like a brassica, you're going to need at least 100 plants in order to ensure an extremely healthy gene pool. Similarly, for sweet corn, we grow around 100 plants in order to produce those. Onions, you can get away with 20 plants, but again, the more, the better. And the only exception appears to be the cucurbits. So they don't seem to suffer from inbreeding depression quite so much, even though they will readily cross-pollinate. And we usually recommend a minimum population of 6. But obviously, you're going to want to think about scaling that up for the seed crops that you require, the quantities that you require. Now, I'm going to briefly stop here before I move on to some very specific examples. Were there any questions that have come through that we can address at this point?
Lisa's asked, is there a handout for this session? And there's lots of info. Yes. Yeah, the toolkit will be up on the Knowledge Hub of Tyfu Cymru's website. There were a few questions going back, Katrina, on the meshes.
Yeah.
Someone was asking what grade was the finer mesh.
Fair enough. Yes, the grade of the finer mesh is 0.22 millimeters by 0.8 millimeters. And that grade mesh is also listed on the handout you've just referred to. So you should be able to pick up the details from there. But yeah, 0.22 times 0.8 millimeters. And we usually buy ours from a standard horticultural supplier. And we do use quite a lot of it. So our sides on our polytunnels, for example, where we've got open-sided polytunnels, we'll use that grade of mesh on them. And also where we construct ad hoc standalone covers for some of our hand-built frames, then we'll use those as well. And you can get them in various widths and lengths for whatever you need.
Thank you. And Stefan was asking, would a row cover for cabbage fly work?
A row cover, what you mean, like hooped down the row of the cabbage? I'm assuming that's what you mean.
Stefan, feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask.
I can try and answer that. That's okay. I can try and answer that. So where we grow our, if this helps at all, where we grow our brassicas, as I mentioned, they need a really large population size. So what we've done is, they don't particularly like growing in polytunnels. We find they can get really hot and a bit stuffy, and then we have all sorts of pest and disease issues, red spider mite, for example, and other issues, fungal issues to do with hot, moist conditions in polytunnels. Some crops love them, but brassicas don't particularly like being grown in polytunnels. What we've done is we've refashioned really large fruit cages. So we have fruit cages outside, but then we use that fine grade mesh, that 0.22 by 0.8 millimeter mesh. We've done a lot of experimenting with sewing machines to basically build covers now that we can then pull over the fruit cages to use them as isolating. Obviously, the issue with isolating crops, and when we look at some specific crops, further along in the session, the moment you isolate them, then you have to then consider how to pollinate. So if you are growing a crop, a brassica crop, that's likely to be near another brassica crop, you are at risk of cross-pollination. So you do need to isolate those crops in some way. If you go along the cover route, then you also need to think about how you're going to introduce pollinators. So I would say brassicas for us, Claire may agree or disagree, but for us, brassicas are the hardest crop to grow for seed because they're biennial. They have self-incompatible flowers. They will easily cross-pollinate with another brassica, and you do need to introduce pollinators in order to produce the seed. Would you like to add anything to that, Claire, at all?
Yeah, I was just going to add about the mesh. One of the main things to remember is to make sure that the flowers don't actually touch the mesh, because they can be pollinated through the mesh. So you need to allow enough space for the flower stalk and the flowers. Make sure there's enough space around your mesh.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
We've had fun and games this year with our brassicas because we've had lockdown and we've discovered that they flowered before we've been able to get the covers open. In which case, all is not lost, but it does take a little bit of effort. But it is something that you can consider. We've removed the flowers, reset the clock, and allow them to reflower. So there are ways around this if you were planning on growing brassicas.
There is a question from Dee. Would Dee like to unmute herself and ask the question?
Oh yeah, hi. I was just wondering, you said again with brassica, like say it's a kale, that you need to do like 100 plants to get enough diversity of seed to avoid the inbreeding, the depression.
Yeah.
But so from 100 plants, how many seed would you take to make sure that you are getting enough genetic diversity? Does that make sense?
Okay, so yeah, we would be growing. Okay, so we would be growing all of them for seed, because and the reason for that is because you're growing in order to produce the seed, you're growing into the second year, and the plant will then flower and set seed in the second year. So if you're going down that route, you can't use them for any other purpose. So you're growing them beyond the edible stage, as it were, for seed production. So that's why we go down that route, and they are the largest population for us, certainly as far as the way we work, to produce seed. There are other brassicas. There are annual brassica of the brassica family, like radish, for example. You can get away with a much smaller population and grow them as an annual. So many of them are annuals, and obviously that's slightly more manageable. But yeah, in terms of seed production for brassicas, you would only be growing them as a biennial full seed. If that makes sense? Whereas I understand where you're coming from. If it was something else like, I don't know, melons or tomatoes, you might be harvesting from across a number of plants, but you might be also using some of those plants for produce as well. In which case, obviously, expand out the population to make sure you've got enough plants to do both.
But I understood that it was that brassica is biennial and it will flower in the second year. But even that, I was just trying to understand the inbreeding depression and like the scale of it. So like if after in year 2 you've got 100 plants, and then out of that 100, how many do you need to select from to avoid the inbreeding? Maybe I didn't phrase it quite right.
Right, no, that's okay. Claire, do you want to come in a little bit on this as well? I'll leave you to answer a bit as well. Thanks, Claire.
Well, in terms of, you're thinking of having a final population going to flower of 100. So there's certain things that you have to bear in mind. Some of them we're going to talk about in future webinars, I think, about selection. So you need to leave a cushion. So you're going to also have losses potentially, or you're going to pick out the best examples. We're going to go on and talk about that at some point. So you need to leave a surplus really. And there's not an absolute rule to that, because you know your site well, so you know what pests and diseases you have. So for example, if we want, for us, and it also depends on the age of seed and whether you think it's going to germinate well. Obviously, the older the seed, you might need to have a greater number of seeds that you sow at the start if you don't think you're going to get 100% germination. So sorry, this isn't a very clear answer, but you need to leave the surplus basically. So you need to factor in several things. So for us, we might decide to sow 150 so that we can select and so that we can choose 100 of the best. So we end up with 100 as a final population size. So when we say 100, we mean a final population size of 100, if that makes sense.
Yes, sorry, I don't think I was clear about that, but yes, I'm talking final population size at the point of harvesting for seed on these. So yeah, accommodating losses on the way is something that needs to be factored in your planning as well. So yeah, sorry, that wasn't particularly clear.
There was another question from Alice. So the covering of individual flowers method only works for inbreeders.
It's not a route that we would recommend. It can be done. To try and try to answer the question, if you could, so let's take something like a tomato, which will happily self-pollinate. That is an inbreeder, and potentially yes, you could cover the an inbreeder, but at risk of cross-pollination. So we would only, for example, cover tomato flowers if they were exposed in some way and could cross-pollinate with another exposed flower type on a different variety. They will still happily self-pollinate, so that becomes less of an issue. Where you have covered flower trusses for an outbreeder, so for something like a runner bean, if you do that, then you do still need to find a way to support that flower to set seed. And for runner beans, and again, we'll talk about individual plants as we go through this course, but for runner beans, they need to be tripped to set seed. So you may cover them to prevent an insect visiting them, but then you may also need to hand pollinate them in order for them to actually set seed. Again, we're talking general term, we're trying to set out general principles in this first session, but of course, depending on what crop type you second for, will determine what kind of interventions you need to think about. It might help in the next section. We'll do a compare and contrast on a number of example crops, which might help shape your thinking. But I do appreciate that we're covering kind of the basic botany, but there's a whole range of variations and variables that we need to consider when deciding which crops to choose to grow for seed, if that makes sense.
There are a couple more, but should we move the presentation on and then we'll revisit them?
Yeah, it might be, and for those of you who have outstanding questions, it might be that this next section might pick up on some of those questions. So what we're going to do is attempt to pull all of this information together, which is an awful lot of information to bring together, but look at some specific crops and compare and contrast to give you some idea of what you need to consider when you're thinking about growing for seed. So, looking at some specific crops, and we've talked about flower type, we've talked about pollination vectors, we've talked about isolation requirements and population size. So let's look at some specific examples, and we'll go through 5 or 6 examples to give that some context, I hope. So on the left, we've got sweet corn. Now these are crops that will have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. So those of you who are familiar with sweet corn growing, obviously you've got the pollen shedding tassel at the top, and then you've got the sticky silks of the female flower down the stalk of the plant. It's wind pollinated, and it's an annual. It's monoecious, as I say, because it's got separate male and female flowers, and the way that it pollinates. That you need to consider things like when the pollen is released from the male flower, whether or not the female plants are ready to be receptive for that pollen. So you need to think about the pollination methods that you have. Now, for something like sweet corn, again, a large population size, the commercial recommendations are between 50 and 120 plants but that could go up to 200 plants depending on how variable they are and how many you want to end up with your final population. The pollen, as I say, is wind pollinated, and you're talking about an isolation distance that depending on what school of thought, could be anywhere between 1/2 mile and 2 miles. Now, obviously, if you're growing a large population size outside in a rural area where there might be other crops being grown for animal feed, for example, you do need to consider this because they will cross-pollinate. Signs of crossing will only, again, be shown in the next generation. So the product that you harvest won't necessarily demonstrate evidence of cross-pollination until you sow that seed in a future year. So changes to super sweet corn, if it cross-pollinates with another sort of maize variety nearby, that won't be evidence until you grow that again. Broad bean, again, another popular crop for seed production, but also another popular crop for animal food production in your local area. So if you have the space to grow a large population of broad beans, you do need to bear in mind whether or not field beans are being grown, again, potentially within up to 1/2 mile. They are insect pollinated, but insects love to travel to broad beans. Their scent and their appearance are very attractive. And as a consequence, that isolation distance needs to be considered. If you can isolate them by distance, that's great. If not, again, you do need to consider how you're going to isolate them and then pollinate them. So they are partial inbreeders, which means they will self-pollinate. And if you can prevent them from cross-pollinating, you will get some seed. But longer term, there is a potential risk of inbreeding depression. So we hand pollinate our broad beans. Clearly, if you're doing this on a large scale, this is not particularly practical. It's incredibly time consuming in order to do that. So if you are able to grow them somewhere where they will be pollinated by insects, but are not at risk of cross-pollinating with another variety nearby, then that's worthwhile. Slightly smaller population because of this partial inbreeding, 20 to 30 plants, 24 plants, I think is our recommendation. But again, something that you need to bear in mind. We looked briefly at cucurbits, so you might be considering growing a crop like some kind of squash. Again, as we talked, although it's an outbreeder, you need a relatively small population in comparison in order to ensure a healthy gene pool. But of course, they will readily cross-pollinate. We consider 6 plants as a minimum to be fine. Obviously, it depends how you're growing them. So you might want to be growing some for seed, or you might be wanting to grow some for produce. But again, you do need to be able to consider isolation and pollination methods in order to do that. We grow them in polytunnels. It gives them a nice long growing season in order to harvest the seed. It also means that we can then hand pollinate and prevent a risk of cross-pollination. They'll have separate male and female flowers where you'll need to physically transfer the pollen from one to another. The crop to the right, tomato, as a way of contrast to all of the crops that we've considered so far, they are by far the simplest crops to produce for seed if they're not a cross-pollinating type. And you get the added benefit of having some fruit left as well if you're planning to use them for a secondary product as well. They are perfect flowers. In most cases, they will happily self-pollinate. Again, similar population size, we would recommend a minimum of 6, depending on what your plans are in terms of seed production. But they're generally pretty easy crops, and you get a product that you can use as well. And finally, 2 very contrasting crops, something like a carrot or even parsnip. Again, biennial, so we will be looking at biennial crop production further along, and the issues of selection and population sizes required for those crops. So to give you an idea, as Claire mentioned, although our final crop requirement might be 20 to 30 plants to produce seed in their second year, the selection requirements for a very variable outbreeder like a carrot means that you are going to be sowing probably hundreds of roots in the first year in order for you to select down. So again, something you need to consider. They are insect pollinated. You can hand pollinate them with brushes. We isolate them in polytunnels. You do need to be thinking about prevention of cross-pollination, either from other crops, other carrot crops, or wild relatives, wild carrot relatives that might cross-pollinate them. And again, the final crop, just to contrast for you to start thinking about, if you are right at the start of this process and considering crop production, then something like a climbing French bean or even a dwarf French bean is a good place to start. They have perfect flowers, they're self-pollinators, they are quite happy inbreeders, which means that you don't need a huge population size, and they are annuals, so you'll be able to produce your seed crop in a single growing season. So I'm going to pause there, and Claire and myself appreciate you listening to all of this. I'm very conscious that you will probably have a whole range of crops that you're considering at this stage. I hope that this session at least gives you an introduction to some of the key principles and thinking around your planning for growing season for seed. And obviously what with this session will ask you to think about is, what do you know about your crop? What do you know about its flower type? The pollination methods that are required to produce the seed, and with it those isolation requirements and potential population sizes that you need to plan your growing season. So I'm going to pause here for a moment and really open this up for further discussion and answer your questions about specific crops that you have in mind.
Thank you, Katrina. If anybody would like to ask a question, just unmute yourselves and ask away.
Everyone's being a little bit shy.
Hi, can you hear me? Wait, I need to stop my video. Hi, so I'm thinking about growing spinach seed. So my question for that is, because it is male and female plant, right? So I'm growing all these plants. How do I know that it's male and female before the flowers? How do I select the plant?
So, well, we don't. When we have a handful of seed at the start of our growing year, and we grew spinach, was it last year or the year before? I can't remember, Claire. Basically, you start off with a packet of seed, and you can't tell by the seed whether or not it's going to produce. Well, there may be ways, but the way we're working, we're not determining whether that seed is male or female, or will produce male or female plants at the start of the process. So I would say a few key things to bear in mind. Obviously, the number of plants you grow end up with seedlings that you start off with. More or less, only half of them are going to be the plants that you end up harvesting seed from. So the male plants, and we experimented slightly with a couple of varieties we had in our collection. So when you'll see as they start to flower, you'll see the female plants will have the little sticky spikes on them. The male plants will be visibly shedding pollen. It's wind pollinated, so the slightest touch you'll see that the pollen is available. We tagged the plants just for our own interest so that we could count up how many we had. One variety was 60-40, the other was 40-60. So, you know, assume that half of the plants you're going to discard once the pollination process is complete. So once the pollen phase is over, you will obviously then leave the remaining plants, and we would recommend removing them, the male plants, when you're done, because it gives them a bit more space to ripen and dry and make sure there's plenty of air around the plants. But yeah, you're going to need to factor that in. So you're going to need twice as many plants growing at that first stage as you're going to end up with plants producing the seed.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to add on that, Claire, at all?
Just if they're isolated, just give them really good shake, really, to mimic the wind. That's quite a good thing to do. Do that a few times.
Yeah.
No, thanks. I have a follow-up question on that. This came up early, and I think it's very interesting. For example, for spinach, we do a few cuts with spinach normally when we grow them for the leaves, right? Is it something you can do as well when you grow for seeds, so you just leave them can express the physiology without disturbing.
So if I understand your question correctly, you might have a whole plot of spinach and you're going to be harvesting that spinach for a period of time for your product.
Yeah.
I would recommend that you have plants that you're not harvesting from in order to produce the seed, simply because you want them to put all that energy into flowering and producing seed rather than responding to you removing leaves and trying to sort of to grow in response to that. So yes, in theory, yes, of course, you could have a whole set of plants. You'll know how many plants you want to be growing for your own produce, but within that population, and for spinach, you might need to remind me, Claire, is it about 30 plants that we grow?
Yeah, I think it's similar to beetroot, isn't it? So yeah, 30 to 40, I think.
So you might want to just leave 30 or 40 plants untouched in order to be able to do that, and just harvest the seed from those. What you want to avoid is any kind of environmental pressure that will cause them to bolt. So there is a difference between seed production and environmental stress, for example, and that comes from experience of knowing your crop. But yes, within a single growing season, those plants will naturally start to flower and then produce seed. But yeah, you will need to do a bit of shaking of them. So if you're going to have them allocated, I'd have them in one space, so that you can actually go around ensuring that the plants will pollinate. If you're outside, that's probably less of an issue, but as with all wind pollinated, you want to be growing in a block to ensure that you've got a good, a bit like sweet corn, you want to make sure you've got a good way of ensuring that they are pollinated. Thanks, Evelyn.
Hi, can I ask a quick question? Hi, yeah, we're thinking we're going to do a couple of different ones, like the easy ones, like peas and French beans, but interested in experimenting with quinoa, and wondered if you'd done that before or know anything about the nuances of that.
We haven't got quinoa in our collection, so we haven't grown the seed before. We might come back to you on that, but having grown it myself for food, or for grain at least, rather than the leaves, I would have to check, but I'm assuming it's wind pollinated. And again, if that's the case, then I would treat it in the same way as spinach, but I'm going to have to check. I have to be honest, I'm going to have to put my hands up and say, I don't know. I'll have to go back and check for you, but I can find that out, and we can always drop an email if that's something that you're planning to grow. I would say as a general rule, there's a general rule, and from my experience of growing quinoa for food, which was not very good, I have to say, so you might not want to take any advice from me on that one, was obviously you need a very long growing season, and you need to have a period of time where the crop can dry effectively. And I found that, and I was growing for grain, effectively growing for seed, that unfortunately the wet weather set in before I could effectively harvest for seed. So you may be better off growing under cover if it's likely to be an issue for you, or you might want to consider ensuring that the growing season is long enough that you capture the grain end of the harvest at the right time of year. But I have to hold my hands up and say I need to go off and check my facts for that. But I will get back to you, Naomi. Perhaps I'll go through Katie or one of the contacts at Tyfu Cymru just to make sure that you've got that information.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's all right, thank you. Were there any specific crops that we haven't, other than quinoa, that we haven't touched on this session that you might have a question about in terms of isolation?
Yeah, hi, Katrina.
Hiya.
This is probably a really stupid question, but I've got one polytunnel, and I'd like to grow, basically, I grow anyway, tomatoes and aubergines and peppers. I know they're all kind of of the same family, the nightshade family. Is that going to have any effect? Do I need to do any separation inside, or will those three kind of crops be okay together?
That's not a stupid question at all. Yeah, absolutely. You can. So in our polytunnels, if you can picture them, we've got we're probably going to be growing maybe 15 different crops in a polytunnel, depending on what population sizes we need. And it's certainly it's not unusual for us to be growing an aubergine, a pepper, and a tomato in the same polytunnel. You do need to. In fact, we grow multiple tomatoes in a single polytunnel. So as long as there's not a risk of insects transferring pollen from another pepper variety somewhere else, or another aubergine variety from somewhere else, then that's absolutely fine. So yeah, we stick in our polytunnel. We will have just one of something that will cross-pollinate with another one of another thing. So we'll only have one runner bean variety in a polytunnel, but we might have multiple tomato varieties in a polytunnel. If that answers your question. But yeah, your original question, yeah, we treat them as all separate. Where it becomes a little bit of a grey area is something like squashes. So you can get, we can get Mosquito and Maxima and Pepo varieties of squash. We err on the side of caution, and we only ever grow one squash type in a polytunnel, regardless of whether we think it's a Maxima or Pepo or whatever type of squash. We will be super cautious on that. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Claire? Am I covering that?
No, I think you put that pretty well covered. Yeah, that's fine. Yes. That's fine.
And bear in mind with peppers, chilies and sweet peppers, they will definitely cross-pollinate. So you would definitely need to keep them separate. And I think we recommend an isolation distance of 50 metres or some kind of protection barrier. Growing them in a polytunnel would be a good example of that.
There's a question from Lauren. Would you like to read your question?
Oh, yeah. Hiya. I don't know if this is me being stupid, but I was just a bit confused about the cucurbits. And if I'm right, they're outbreeders and therefore cross-pollinate. But if they're, and it's okay to hand pollinate them, which I attempted to do last year, but the rains kind of ruined my attempts. But will continuous hand pollination lead to inbreeding depression then? Am I getting confused?
They seem to cope quite well with the small population size. I think we don't find that they need a very large population to prevent inbreeding depression. What we do find is they're highly variable. So and they will readily cross-pollinate. So those are the factors that we tend to worry about. So we do isolate them. We do the same as you. We hand pollinate. You may be closing up flowers if you're outside in some way, or
yeah, that's what I tried. So if you recommend a population of say 6, then, but if you're hand pollinating them by isolating an individual flower,
yes,
should you be getting the male pollen from all of the other 6 plants?
Yes, of course. Yes, sorry, I completely understand what you're saying now. Yes, so what we do, and in fact this is the case with all of our hand pollinating activities, and we might do that with runner beans, broad beans, and squashes, is that we will transfer pollen from another plant. Yeah, sorry, we're going into the detail now, but I wasn't specific when I was describing the population size. So yeah, as best practice, we are trying to ensure that there's genetic diversity within the gene pool for that particular variety, but also keeping other varieties pollen away from that particular variety so it doesn't cross-pollinate. So yeah, we would definitely recommend you take the pollen from a male flower from another plant and use that to transfer to the female flower on the plant that you're going to produce the fruit on. Is there anything you would add to that, Claire, at all?
No, I think as long as you're spreading the pollen around the 6 plants.
Mummy, I got to
excuse me, sorry. As long as you're spreading the pollen around the 6 plants and not just in one plant, then that should be fine. I suppose the difficulty that we find that sometimes we get a lot of male flowers and we don't have female flowers at the same time. I don't know if you've had that problem as well. But you generally get a crop of male flowers first and then the female flowers follow. But yeah, as long as you're taking it from an individual flower from each of the 6 plants, it should be fine. in terms of inbreeding depression.
Great, thank you.
There's a follow-on. Sorry, Katrina. There was a follow-on question from Emma on how do you hand pollinate?
Right. So depends what you're doing. If you're talking about, was there a specific crop that you had in mind? Because there are different methods. I don't know whether she would like to unmute.
Yes, I'm particularly interested in pumpkins because I've ordered myself some ones that have had to come from America, so I'm quite keen to not have to do that again because it was expensive. They're pink ones, so I want those are the particular ones I want to do this year. Just get more pink pumpkins. So I was it with a brush, or do you snap the the pollen out and rub it in? I wasn't sure.
Well, if Claire's able to join in at some point, that would be fine. But I appreciate you may have. That's fine. Cool. Do you want to describe what you do? I mean, I know we peel back the petals of the male flower to do that.
Yeah.
But there are different methods of doing that. Do you want to just talk through, Claire, how that's done?
Well, I suppose the simplest way to start, and you may know this already, is to know the difference between the male and the female flowers. So the female flowers will have a little embryonic squash behind it, and the male flowers will just purely have the flower on a stalk. And so in terms of pollination, what we do in a polytunnel is just to gently take off the petals of the male flower, and that exposes the pollen, and you can see the pollen on the end of the male structure. And then we just dust that. So we break it off at that point, and then we just dust it. We find a female flower and just gently dust it inside the female flower. It's as simple as that. You could do it with a brush, and that way I guess you can mix up but you're not breaking off an actual male flower, but I don't think that really matters because we want the female flower. So we just simply break off the petals and just use the male flowers to pollinate the female flowers.
Are you doing this outside, or are you doing this in?
Sorry, this is in a polytunnel.
Yeah. And the grower might be doing this outside, so I'm assuming that they may be tying the flower up at some point to prevent.
So these will be in a polytunnel. I've set aside the polytunnel just for these because I want these ones. All my others can just do what they want. It's these specifically I want, so they are going in the pot.
And that's exactly the same strategy that we would use ourselves, so that's absolutely fine. So yeah, as Claire's described, that's the perfect method for those.
Thank you very much.
Kate mentioned, you mentioned growing the squash plants in the tunnel. Is it possible to save the seeds from the squash outside, which you did just start touching on?
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Obviously, if you're isolated by distance from other squash varieties, then you're fine. Then you don't need to worry about that. If you're not too sure, you might want to be cautious in order to make sure that you don't aren't at risk of cross-pollination. Then you can seal up the flowers once the pollination has occurred. Obviously, eventually the flower itself will drop off, and often it's useful to mark where you've done the pollination as well, so that you know that you have pollinated a flower and that they are fully isolated. But you'll see quite quickly once pollination has been successful, because the fruit will start to swell and the flower itself will fall off. But yeah, and going back to those key principles, squashes are really, when you end up with the next generation of wonky squash, that's when you realise that cross-pollination has occurred in the production of that seed, because the fruit itself won't demonstrate evidence of cross-pollination because it's the seed that's been produced in that growing year that contains the embryonic information, the genetic information that will determine whether or not you end up with a pink squash the following year. So yeah, always be vigilant. If in doubt, don't save the seed from a particular fruit if you feel it's been exposed at some point.
Tilly was asking, just out of interest, how much caution do you have to take when moving between different isolation units at the Heritage Seed Library? Do you have to change clothing when moving between the units that contain plants that could cross-pollinate? And how long can pollen exist and be viable once it has left the flower?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. So we are super, super cautious. So we're growing 100 varieties a year. Some things are, most of which are, you know, pretty simple crops. Peas, French beans, tomatoes, probably are a bulk in our typical growing year. We don't need to worry about any of that. They will generally not be in risk of cross-pollination. But it's the wind-pollinated crops in particular that we're quite cautious about. So we might have a couple of second-year beetroot, for example, growing in separate tunnels because they're cross-pollinators. So they'll be flowering, they'll be wind-pollinated, they'll have lots of very fine pollen. So generally, and Claire mentioned about going and shaping wind-pollinating plants like spinach and beetroot, we won't go into the same polytunnel on the same day to do that. So we might go and visit one of the tunnels, shape the plant, to produce the pollen, and then keep well away from the other polytunnel until maybe the next day when we've had a change of clothes. Age of lifespan of pollen, that's a really good question. We don't tend to, because of the way we operate, we don't tend to think in those terms, but we will, for a single growing year, make sure, for example, that we don't use the same paintbrushes where we're hand pollinating. So you will find in our polytunnels later on in the year, we've got whole loads of like paintbrushes tucked in the vines of our runner beans, for example, and they'll be allocated for the entire year. Pollen, depending on its type, will have a different lifespan, but I couldn't give you numbers for specific crops. We're just super cautious about how we operate, but you know, we take necessary precautions with our equipment and our routines to make sure that we don't do that. Wind pollination is the hardest, of course, because the pollen is so light and you will come out covered in pollen when you do that.
Thank you. Lisa is asking, is there somewhere that lists the different characteristics of the plants and numbers needed, etc.?
Yes, yes, and as if by plan, I'm trying to move on to the next slide. There we go. Our seed saving guidelines. I know that the Tyfu Cymru website has lots of resources, and you'll be directed to those, and obviously information about growing crops. I know Katie has sent out some information. Katie Hastings has sent information about crops and general population sizes, and also our website. We have seed saving guidelines for individual crops, and they cover everything from isolation distances to population sizes and pollination methods and isolation methods where required. So if you're not too sure, we're still building up that information. So if you're not too sure, obviously get in touch with the Tyfu Cymru project to look at the resources on the website, but we do also have information about specific things like that. And as we go through the course, as I said, what we're hoping to do by introducing these principles is then to start building on those understandings and looking at specific crops. So there's the information about where to look on the Tyfu Cymru website as well.
Thank you. Alex was asking, how do you overcome the problem in squashes if the male flowers come out first and then the females?
Claire, are you able to jump in on that?
I think it's just a question of waiting. So you, not to think, oh no, we haven't got any female flowers. Generally, you get male flowers more first, but then the females flower. So flowers come out as well.
So, you know, our experience, although it hasn't always been, although you will have more male flowers to female and an earlier flowering rate, that generally isn't an issue. You just need to be patient, really, and those, you know, that they will produce the female flowers eventually, and they're the ones that you're looking for when you start that process of hand pollination. you know, and I think again factoring in that with your seed production, just bear in mind, you know, the squash plants that we're growing, the cocoa plants that we're growing, we might only be harvesting 1 or 2 fruits from each of those plants. So you do need to get to know your crop and understand that you're going to be putting an awful lot of effort into creating that pollination, into hand pollinating, but you're going to be nurturing those fruits as they develop. So you may want to make sure you have a very long growing season in order for those fruits to ripen. So you might have a cut-off point with other fruits that are much smaller. So again, you want to kind of factor that into your growing year. So we might only harvest 1 or 2 squash from a particular variety per plant, because we put all of our energy into the hand pollination and then ensuring that those fruits ripen up to the standard you need to produce the seed, to harvest the seed from them.
And Alice is asking, in terms of the outbreeders, for the polytunnel isolation method, do you have doors with mesh to exclude pollinators, so no open doors?
Absolutely. So obviously the important time is when they're flowering. So you can be a little bit, you know, less concerned if they're not flowering. But obviously from our point of view, we've got multiple crops going on in the polytunnel, and you might decide to do the same if you go down the route of growing several different vegetable types for seed. So yes, yes, well spotted. We have layered mesh doors, curtains, effectively weighted curtains. We'll have sliding doors over them where we can, and we're careful about going. It's all about risk management. You're never going. We do get insects on our polytunnels. It would be impossible for us to keep all insects out, but it is about managing that level of risk. And obviously, the fewer you have in there, the better. And of course, as a consequence of that, as I'm sure you've worked out, by isolating crops that are outbreeders and need to be pollinated by something, you then have to mimic that. And whether that's hand pollination or something we haven't talked about is introducing pollinators into your polytunnel. So we use a lot of flies from angling shops. So we buy white maggots and allow them to pupate and emerge as flies. I haven't gone into too much detail for that, but looking at crops that are self-incompatible in terms of flowers, like your brassicas, onions, or alliums generally, then you might want to think about how you are going to introduce pollinators to do that job. So some things just aren't practical to hand pollinate, and that includes brassicas.
I think that's all the questions in the chat. So does anybody have any other burning questions they would like to ask? They've all gone quiet on us again.
Well, either they're overwhelmed with the amazing information, or we've managed to answer some of their questions, which is good. I think all I would add really is that this is a lot of information to take in as an introduction to all of the botanical ranges of what we need to think about when we're talking about seed production. But the next webinar will look at some of the detail of planning. So factoring population sizes into your crop rotation planning, understanding what structures you need to be planning for if you're going to go for a climbing vegetable type, for example. So hopefully we'll keep coming back to these principles and keep building on them in future sessions. So hopefully we'll be able to pick up on specific crops that you are interested in growing for seed and take it from there.
Alice, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just still formulating it, but but French beans, you wouldn't need to isolate them at all. I think I'm thinking of your pictures and not sure if they were runner beans or French beans.
Okay, fair enough.
But French beans are inbreeders, and so you wouldn't need to do any sort of isolation for them at all.
No, no. I mean, they're not entirely, not 100% without risk. So there are occasions, for example, where bees will be very interested in drilling into the back of the flowers, for example, to access nectar. And there is associated with that a slight risk that they could also then therefore transfer pollen from another French bean variety. I would say that's quite relatively low risk. I mean, there would be evidence of that, but I would say that's relatively low risk. I would say probably the greater risk is, and which is why we space the way we grow our French beans, is the risk of different varieties growing into each other. And by the time they've ripened, they may have very similar pod colours, for example, or similar seed coat colours. So there are other risks associated with plants growing near to each other you don't need to worry about cross-pollination quite so much. I think we do recommend an isolation distance of about 10 metres, something along those lines, for a French bean, but from all sorts of practical reasons, that is good practice anyway, to do that. But I would reiterate, if you're right at the start of this process or thinking about what you need, I would definitely say that peas, French beans, and in fact, dwarf French beans might be a good start, because then you don't even have to worry about the structures that you need to grow the plants up. Although you will get a higher yield with a climbing French bean, and you'll also have less issues and risks of low-lying foliage and slugs and snails, for example.
And getting them dried as well with the dwarf French beans is maybe a bit like we've saved runner beans here, but not.
Yeah. So yes, again, and we'll be progressing through these examples throughout the course. But with something like a French bean, the reason why they just do work so well is that you've got an annual season in which you can grow them. They don't need much fuss in terms of isolation and pollination. They'll happily self-pollinate, which means you don't need a massive population size. But the key thing is you do need to ensure that they are that they have the full growing season to ripen, and you want them to get to that really crispy pod stage. So you might need to think about, do you have the facility, the space to maybe uproot plants later on in the year when the season starts getting damper or wetter, and you still need to dry off those pods. You don't want to lose your harvest at that stage in the year. So maybe you need to think about what drying facilities you would have to finish a crop off if you can't leave them outside until the pods are completely ready to harvest. I think that's
so. Might the point at which you could do that be when they're the beans are fully formed, they're starting to dry, you could then uproot them? Is there an indicator point?
I mean, I think ideally keep them on the vine for as long as possible. But then, of course, you do run the risk, that if they did get extremely dry and you had a fantastically sunny second half to the year, then you've always got the risk of them splitting, and you could start losing seeds as well. I mean, that's less likely, but always possible. So yes, we would say we call a kind of nail test is what we say we would use. So when you've got to that stage, obviously you can feel that the pod is pretty dry. When you open the seed, you press your nail in it, and if there's some resistance to leaving a mark on the seed coat, often that's a good indicator that the seed is ready to harvest, and you can dry it off a little bit further. It's a balance of risk. Are you going to lose that crop because it's all of a sudden you're going to have a load of wet weather and it's just not going to dry off and it's going to go mouldy, in which case, yes, please do bring it inside. Or you could think about peas. So peas have a shorter growing season in terms of seed production, so you're more likely to capture the full harvest at a short period of time in the year. So for us, I think the earliest we can harvest pea, and I'm talking in polytunnels here, but so it'll be a slightly longer outside, is going to be from June, end of June onwards. So which will be sooner than a French bean. So that's something you could think about as well, if you were worried about how long growing season you have to dry with crops. Okay, thanks, Alice.
There's a question from Lauren. Could you talk about the implications of a plant being self-incompatible? Are they always outbreeders? Does it just mean you need decent population sizes?
Yes, so when we talk, examples of self-incompatible are going to be things like alliums, so leeks and onions. So it means that although the flower is perfect, and we're talking about this cluster of flowers on the head of an allium, although the flowers are perfect, which means that there will be pollen produced and a male and female part within the same flower structure. It does the plant itself, the cluster of flowers does need pollen transferred from one flower to another in order for it to pollinate and produce the seed. So if you look at an allium head, it's got lots of, it will produce lots of individual seed in that head. So in terms of population size, yes, you do. I think for alliums, we're talking about 20 to 30 plants, which actually is not a huge amount of space for seed production, but yes, they are outbreeded. On the other end of the scale, self-incompatible like brassicas, or if we're talking biennial brassicas like cabbages and kale, then yes, because they're highly variable and you need to select down, and because they're self-incompatible, then we're talking a larger population. So we grow a large population with an end population of ideally around 100 plants.
Well, thank you very much, Katrina. Yeah, Lauren just said thank you. Yeah.
That's all right. Thank you, Lauren.
So thank you, Katrina and Claire, for such an interesting presentation. And if there aren't any more questions, then I'll hand over to Katie Hastings, who's just going to do a bit of a group session to finish.
Thank you.
That was a really great session, loads of amazing information. So thanks for that. I was planning to have an opportunity now for people to talk about the seed crops that you want to grow this year. But I also feel like a lot of those questions have probably just come out in the Q&A because you were all asking about specific crops. So I'm not sure if there's really a need to kind of have a further discussion about your crops. But the idea of this course, as we spoke about last month, is that while you're taking part in these 12 sessions, you'll all be producing a seed crop at the same time. And you can kind of ask us questions between the sessions if you need to, and hopefully also share information with one another about what you're learning and how your crops are doing. So I did a survey at the end of last session, and some of you were interested to have a private Facebook group to communicate with one another. So I set that up earlier today, and you should all have the link to that. So if you want to just request access, then I'll let you into the group, and then that'll allow you to kind of post crop updates to one another. And then also some of you were keen on a WhatsApp group, so I'm actually going to do both of them because some of you wanted WhatsApp and some of you wanted Facebook, and I think that's fine to have them both running simultaneously. So those of you who gave me your numbers, I will add you to that WhatsApp group as well. And if you haven't already filled in the survey that I sent and given me your number and you want to be on the WhatsApp group, then just drop me an email and I'll add you onto that. So basically both of those things will give us opportunity to communicate between these sessions. Am I correct in thinking that your kind of crop specific questions have all come out now in the Q&A, or does anyone want to raise their hand and say that you'd really like to talk more about what seed crops you're going to put in? Or maybe you need to go away and think. I can't see anyone, so I think we've taken in a lot of amazing information. So maybe our brains are all full. So yeah, I guess we can leave it at that. And I did send some brief notes about crops to consider. If you're still stuck and you're still thinking you have no idea what seed to produce this year, then there's those notes that I sent that are kind of some of the easier ones and some of the just brief things about considerations if you're still not sure what to grow. But otherwise, I guess we'll just leave it that we'll talk on Facebook and WhatsApp, and then we obviously have our next session, which is the 18th of March, and we're going to be with Katrina again talking about crop planning. So I guess, yeah, we're going to talk more about, I think we have in there space requirements and rotation and some more differences between annuals and biennials. But hopefully well, it obviously depends on what you're growing, but by the next session, you will have definitely decided what seed crops you're going to grow this year so that you can kind of progress through, sowing them in the ground. All right, well, yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Katrina, Claire and Katie. It's been a fantastic session, and thank you all for attending. You'll see I've just popped in the chat box a quick survey which we ask for you to fill out. It just gives us great feedback on what what Tyfu Cymru puts on, and the great thing about Tyfu is it's demand led, so you know, the more information you give us, and then the more we can put on for you. So thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you all next time. Good night.
Thanks.